The morning began like any other, yet something felt heavier in the air for the teen walking into the courthouse. She clutched a worn folder close to her chest as if it were a shield. Her guardian walked beside her, constantly glancing over to make sure she was all right. Even though she didn't say it out loud, he knew she was nervous. Anyone could tell her steps were slow, her eyes kept scanning the building, and she took a deep breath before entering the courtroom. The courtroom itself felt bigger on the inside than it looked outside. Long wooden benches filled the room, and people whispered quietly while waiting for their cases to be heard. Some looked tired. Some looked annoyed. A few looked worried. It was the usual mix of emotions you'd expect in a place where people hoped for fairness but feared the unknown. The teen sat down beside her guardian, placing the folder in her lap. She held it carefully, like it was something precious. And in a way it was. Inside were documents she had been studying for weeks, papers she believed no one else had taken seriously. She didn't plan to speak. She wasn't even required to say anything. But she had read every page so many times that each line felt burned into her memory. She looked around the room. Lawyers walked in and out of the judge's chambers. A few clerks typed quickly on their computers, barely noticing the crowd. The judge entered the courtroom with a calm but firm presence. Everyone rose to their feet automatically. When he asked them to sit, the room settled into a quiet stillness. The case involving the teen and her guardian wasn't the only one on the schedule. But when their turn came, her heart thudded so loudly she wondered if the microphone at the front would pick it up. The judge asked the parties to come forward. Her guardian stepped ahead, but she followed quietly, almost hiding behind him. She didn't want unnecessary attention. She didn't want anyone staring at her. But she was there because she had seen something in the paperwork, something she felt didn't match what people had been saying for months. She wasn't sure if anyone would listen to her, but she hoped someone would. At least once, when the first witness spoke, the teen listened closely. She had listened before, many times. Today was no different, except that her hands trembled slightly. She tried to calm herself, reminding she wasn't trying to argue. She was only trying to help the truth come out in a respectful way. People continued to speak, lawyers, officials, and a few community members. Some details were correct. Others were slightly twisted, probably by accident or by people forgetting things over time. The teen felt a strange pressure building in her chest, like she was carrying a secret she wasn't supposed to keep, and then one statement made her lift her head. It was small. Barely noticeable, something said quickly and confidently. But it wasn't right. It didn't match the documents she had studied over and over. The adults in the room didn't react. They moved on as if everything was normal. But she froze, gripping the edge of the folder tightly. Her guardian noticed the change in her posture. He whispered to her, "It's okay. Just breathe." She nodded, but the words still echoed in her mind. She couldn't ignore them. If she didn't say something now, something important might go wrong. When the judge asked if anyone had anything to add, the teen slowly stood up. Her legs felt a little shaky, but she kept her voice soft and respectful. "Your Honor, may I say something?" The judge glanced at her with a look that wasn't unkind, just surprised. He was used to hearing from lawyers and adults, not teens who looked like they should be in school rather than standing in a courtroom. Before she could continue, he raised a hand. "Young lady, please sit down." His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried the kind of authority that made most people step back immediately. Some heads in the courtroom turned. A few people whispered. Others looked confused. Most assumed she was just emotional or upset by the situation. No one expected she had something meaningful to add. The teen swallowed. She looked at her guardian, wondering if she should try again or just obey. But he gave her a small nod, the kind that silently said, "If you believe it's important, you can speak." She turned back to the judge. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't let it stop her. "Your Honor, I'm not trying to interrupt. I heard something that doesn't match the documents, and I think it could be important." The judge frowned a little, more out of surprise than irritation. It was rare for a young person to speak with such calmness after being told to sit down. He leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. She didn't look rebellious. She didn't look disrespectful. She looked sincere and nervous, like someone who was carrying something heavy. What exactly do you think is incorrect? The judge asked, choosing his words carefully. The teen opened the folder and pulled out a paper with highlighted lines. Her hands shook, but she held the paper with determination. Earlier, the statement about the timeline. It doesn't match this record. I read this document last night, and the date here shows something different from what was just said. The judge blinked, caught off guard. It wasn't unusual for adults to get dates wrong, but it was unusual for a teen to challenge a statement in front of a courtroom full of people. He motioned for the bailiff to bring the document forward. While he read it, the room fell into a thick silence. Even people who had been whispering earlier stopped to watch. The teen looked at the floor, trying to calm her racing heartbeat. She wasn't sure if she had done the right thing. Maybe she had made everything worse, but she couldn't ignore the truth. She had spent weeks studying these papers because she wanted things to be fair, not just for herself, but for everyone involved. After a long pause, the judge placed the paper down and looked back at her. His expression had changed, just slightly, but enough that the lawyers in the room noticed. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was curiosity. The teen didn't know it yet, but this moment, this small, quiet moment, was the beginning of everything changing. She wasn't trying to be bold, and she wasn't trying to take control. She had simply spoken up because something inside her told her she had to. The judge cleared his throat. You said you studied these documents? Yes, Your Honor, she replied softly. I've been reading everything because I wanted to understand what was happening. He looked at her for another moment, then leaned forward slightly. We will continue, but I'll come back to this point. She nodded and slowly sat back down, her heart still racing. Her guardian whispered, You did good. She wasn't sure. She wasn't trying to be impressive. She was just trying to help, but people in the courtroom began glancing at her differently, curious, surprised, and even a little impressed. It was unusual to see someone so young stand up so calmly, especially after being told to remain seated. It wasn't that she had challenged authority. It was that she had spoken with quiet respect and clarity, and although she didn't realize it yet, this small moment, this gentle insistence to speak the truth was going to change far more than she expected. It was the first spark in a story that would soon shift the entire direction of the case. The courtroom felt different after the teen spoke. People who hadn't even noticed her before were now glancing in her direction, some with curiosity, some with surprise. Whispered conversations passed quietly along the benches, but she tried her best to ignore them. She wasn't trying to be the center of attention. She didn't even want attention. All she wanted was for the truth to be understood clearly. The judge continued listening to the next witness, but every now and then his eyes flicked toward the teen as if he was still thinking about what she had said. She could feel the weight of those glances, and they made her sit up straighter, though her hands still trembled slightly. She kept the folder open on her lap, the pages shifting under her fingertips. She had read them so many times that she could almost recall the lines by heart. A lawyer began speaking again, going over details about the timeline. Once again, the teen noticed small errors slipping into the discussion. It wasn't that the adults were careless. It was simply that the case had stretched on for months. Dates blurred. Statements were repeated until they became mixed with opinions. People remembered things differently, and those differences had quietly turned into confusion. She didn't want to speak again. She really didn't, but each time someone mentioned the wrong date or skipped over a detail she knew mattered, she felt her stomach tighten. She quietly whispered to her guardian, "Why is no one checking the papers?" Her guardian gave a small sigh. "Sometimes people get used to the way things were said before. They stop checking." "But it changes everything," she whispered. He nodded. "I know." The teen sat silently, but her mind kept circling around the mistakes she heard. She didn't want to correct everything. She wasn't trying to act smarter than anyone. But there was one moment she couldn't ignore, a statement about a rule she had specifically studied. It was something she had discovered late one night while searching through the internet and the documents. She had even written it down because she felt it mattered. When the judge paused to ask if there were any clarifications before moving on, She felt her breath catch. She knew if she didn't speak now, the misunderstanding might become a permanent part of the case. Her hands shook, but she lifted them slightly, showing she wished to speak. Her guardian looked at her with concern. "Are you sure?" "I think I have to," she whispered. The judge saw her raised hand. His eyebrows lifted a little, and he said, "You have something to add?" She stood slowly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your Honor, I'm sorry to speak again, but I think there's another mistake about the rule that was mentioned." The room fell silent again. People leaned slightly forward, curious. Some smiled politely, expecting her to be mistaken or confused. Others seemed unsure what to think. It wasn't common for someone her age to speak, especially twice in the same hearing. The judge took a slow breath. His tone was firm but not unkind. "You're saying there is a mistake in the legal explanation?" "Yes, Your Honor. I think so." She carefully held up the folder. "I read about it because I didn't understand it at first. But the rule is not exactly how it was said here. It has a different requirement." The judge narrowed his eyes slightly, not out of anger, but out of interest. "What requirement are you referring to?" She opened the folder to a page marked with a sticky note. She looked nervous, but she read the words with a quiet steadiness. "The rule says the statement can't be used unless the person had a chance to respond to it before. But in this case, they didn't, so I don't think it can be part of the argument." The judge blinked, surprised. That wasn't the sort of correction he expected. It wasn't a small date issue. It wasn't a misremembered detail. It was an actual legal point, something that even experienced adults overlooked when moving quickly. One of the lawyers shifted in discomfort. Another cleared his throat awkwardly. A third looked at the document she was referring to as if suddenly unsure whether they had missed something obvious. The judge leaned forward. "And where did you find this information?" "In the rules online and in the documents," she replied softly. "I didn't know a lot about this case at first, so I looked everything up. I read it many times because I wanted to understand." Her voice carried no pride. It wasn't a brag. It was just the truth, simple and honest. The judge glanced at the lawyers. "Did any of you reference this rule?" The lawyers exchanged looks. A few papers shuffled. One finally replied, "We didn't discuss that specific section today, Your Honor." The judge didn't say anything for a moment. He simply looked at the teen. She stood quietly, not moving, waiting for whatever he would say next. She wasn't trying to challenge them. She didn't even realize how unusual her comment was. She only wanted accuracy, fairness. "Child," the judge said slowly, "I'd like to hear exactly why you believe this rule changes the situation." She felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't used to speaking in front of so many people, especially not someone as authoritative as a judge. But she took a breath and did her best to explain. Because if the rule means the statement isn't allowed, then the decision that was made before, it was based on something that shouldn't be used. It changes the meaning of what happened. Her explanation wasn't complex. It wasn't filled with legal language, but it was clear. Clear enough that the judge leaned back and looked truly taken aback. "You're saying the earlier decision might be wrong?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied gently. The judge motioned for the bailiff to collect the document from her. He studied it closely. For several long moments, the room was so quiet that even the sound of pages turning echoed. The teen felt her heart pounding. What if she had misunderstood something? What if she misread the rule? What if she embarrassed herself and her guardian? All the doubts rushed through her at once, but she kept standing, waiting respectfully. After reading the page carefully, the judge passed it to the clerk and then looked at the lawyers. "Can someone explain why this rule was not brought up earlier?" No one had a good answer. A few murmured vague explanations about oversight and assumptions. The teen stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, not trying to draw attention or defend herself. She simply waited, her honesty evident in her expression. The judge finally turned back to her. "And how old are you?" She answered softly. The judge exhaled slowly, almost like he didn't believe what he was seeing. "You've understood more about these documents than many adults I've seen stand in this courtroom." The words made her cheeks warm again, and she lowered her eyes. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to outsmart anyone. She simply cared enough to read everything because it mattered to her. "Come forward," the judge said. Her guardian touched her arm gently, offering silent reassurance as she stepped toward the bench. Each step felt like walking through thick air. The judge didn't look angry or frustrated, just thoughtful. He asked, "Is there anything else in these documents you believe is important?" She hesitated. She didn't want to overwhelm the room or seem like she was taking over. But she answered honestly, "There are a few things that didn't match what was said earlier. I wasn't sure if I understood everything right, so I didn't want to speak unless it was important. But this part, this one, it felt like it changed too much to ignore." The judge nodded slowly. "I appreciate your honesty." He then did something no one expected. He asked the lawyers to pause the discussion, and he encouraged the teen to explain one more detail she had noticed. She cleared her throat, her voice steadying as she spoke. She explained the timeline she had memorized. How the sequence of events didn't match the assumptions people made. The lawyers listened, trying not to show their surprise. The judge asked her questions, real questions, not the kind asked to dismiss someone politely. He asked them because he wanted to test her understanding. And to the shock of everyone, she answered each question with clarity. Sometimes she paused to think. Sometimes she asked if she could double-check the page before speaking. But she never guessed. She never exaggerated. She simply told the truth based on what she had learned. By the time she finished, the entire atmosphere of the courtroom had shifted. No longer were people whispering about why a teen was talking. Now they whispered about how she knew so much, how she was calm, how she didn't panic under pressure. A few even seemed impressed by her courage. The judge looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "You may return to your seat," he said kindly, "but I will be revisiting what you just shared." She nodded, her heart still pounding, and walked back to the bench beside her guardian. He gave her a small smile filled with pride and reassurance. The teen didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know how the judge would interpret her points or what changes might follow. But she knew one thing for certain: she had spoken the truth when it mattered. And without realizing it, she had just changed the tone of the entire courtroom. The direction of the case had quietly begun to shift, all because she chose to speak when everyone expected her to stay silent. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt different now. It wasn't the usual silence people feel when they're bored or impatient. This silence carried curiosity. It carried respect. It carried the sense that something unexpected had happened and people were still trying to understand it. The teen sat beside her guardian again, her hands folded in her lap. She tried to breathe normally, but her heart was still beating faster than usual. She wasn't used to being the focus of so many eyes. Every time she shifted slightly in her seat, she felt someone glance at her from across the room. She wished she could shrink a little, just enough so no one would look at her, but she didn't regret speaking. She wasn't proud of it either, just relieved that she didn't stay silent when something felt wrong. Still, she had no idea what would happen next. She didn't know whether the judge would fully consider what she said or if he would simply move on, but she didn't have to wait long. After a quiet moment, the judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Before we continue," he said, "I want to revisit the points raised earlier." A few lawyers straightened up. Some shuffled papers. A couple looked slightly uncomfortable, as if wishing they had caught the detail before a teenager did. The teen tried to lower her head, hoping the attention would move away from her. But the judge looked directly at her and then at the lawyers. "There were several important details brought up that we need to examine more closely." He turned to one of the attorneys. "Could you walk us through your interpretation of the rule again?" The lawyer stood, trying not to appear nervous, and repeated his earlier explanation. But as he spoke, it became clear he had not mentioned the part the teen had pointed out. The judge gently stopped him and asked, "And what about the requirement for prior opportunity to respond? Why wasn't that mentioned?" The lawyer hesitated. "Your Honor, that part is usually not the focus in cases like this. We often rely on the general interpretation." The judge raised a brow. "General interpretations don't override written rules." The courtroom shifted with small murmurs. The tension wasn't harsh, but it was noticeable. The teen swallowed. She didn't feel proud watching adults be corrected, but she felt relieved that her concern was taken seriously. The judge then turned his attention to her again. "Young lady," he said, "may I ask you to step forward once more?" She froze for a second. She looked at her guardian, hoping for reassurance. He nodded softly, and that gave her just enough courage to stand up. Her legs felt slightly unsteady, but she walked toward the front of the courtroom anyway. Holding her folder close, the judge spoke gently, not wanting to intimidate her. "You mentioned that you studied these documents on your own. I'd like to understand something. What made you look at them so closely?" Her voice was quiet but steady enough. "Because, Your Honor, when everything first started, I didn't understand anything. I felt confused and scared, and nobody explained things in a way I could follow. So I started reading the papers by myself. I thought maybe if I understood them better, I would feel less confused." Her honesty made a few people shift in their seats, not out of judgment but out of empathy. Her words felt real, something anyone in her position might feel. The judge nodded slowly. "And did you teach yourself how to read legal documents?" "Not really," she said softly. "I just kept reading until things started making sense. I looked up words I didn't understand. I watched some public videos about how certain rules work. It took a long time, but I wanted to know what was happening." The court clerk glanced at her with mild surprise. A lawyer near the front looked down at his notes, perhaps feeling a bit humbled. The judge studied her carefully. There was something admirable in her explanation, something genuine. "And when you realized something was wrong in the statements today," the judge continued, "you felt you needed to speak?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I thought maybe I misunderstood things. But when I checked the page again, it still didn't match. So I thought, if I don't say anything, maybe something unfair might happen." Her voice shook with the last few words, and the judge seemed to notice. His expression softened. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. He leaned slightly forward. "I'm going to ask you a few questions. These are not to test you like an exam. I simply want to understand how you see the details." She nodded. Though she felt her heart thumping harder again, the judge turned to a page in the file and asked, "If we remove the disputed statement, as you mentioned, how does that change the timeline of events?" She adjusted her grip on the folder and replied carefully, "It means the event happened later than what was said earlier. And if it happened later, then the earlier decision was made before some information was even available." That answer made the judge pause. He looked at the papers again. A few lawyers exchanged glances. Even the clerk leaned slightly closer to the judge's desk to see the page. The judge asked another question. "And does this timing matter for the main issue in the case?" She hesitated, not wanting to say something incorrect. She ran her finger along the edge of her folder, thinking carefully. "Yes, it does. Because the decision that was made before didn't include the new information. It means the conclusion might not be complete." Her voice wasn't loud or authoritative. It was simply sincere, but clear enough for the whole courtroom to hear. The judge leaned back in thought. "I see." He flipped another page. "And how did you figure out that this rule mattered?" "Most people don't notice such details." She looked at the floor for a moment, then answered honestly, "I didn't know it mattered at first. I just read everything because I didn't want to make mistakes. And when I saw the rule, I wrote it down. I thought maybe someone would explain it later, but no one ever talked about it." Her simplicity struck the room more deeply than she realized. The judge nodded again. He glanced at the lawyers. "It appears we missed something important." One of them cleared his throat. "Your Honor, it was not intentional." I understand," the judge said calmly. "But oversight does not excuse inaccuracies." He turned back to the teen. "One more question," he said gently. "When you spoke earlier, were you confident in your understanding, or did you worry you might be mistaken?" She almost smiled, but only a little. "I was scared, Your Honor," she admitted. "I thought maybe I was wrong, but even if I was wrong, I felt I should tell you what I saw in the documents. Just in case." A soft murmur moved through the room. Her honesty made the moment feel more human, more grounded in real emotion. People didn't see a teenager trying to outsmart adults. They saw a teenager trying to prevent a misunderstanding. The judge let out a slow breath. "Thank you," he said. "You may take a seat for now." She nodded and walked back to her guardian. Her steps were a little smoother this time, though the pounding in her chest was still there. When she sat down, her guardian leaned close and whispered, "You did very well." She exhaled shakily. "I hope I didn't make things worse." "You didn't," he said with confidence. "You helped more than you know." The judge spent several minutes reviewing the documents again, occasionally stopping to read and reread a highlighted line. The courtroom waited in silence. No one rushed him. No one complained. Everyone seemed to sense that the moment mattered, that something important was unfolding. After what felt like a long time, the judge spoke again. "Based on the information presented, including the points raised earlier, I believe we need clarification." He looked at the lawyers once more. "Did anyone verify the accuracy of the timeline before today's hearing?" One lawyer replied quietly, "We relied on the summaries from the earlier proceedings, Your Honor." "And were those summaries cross-checked with the original documents?" the judge asked. The lawyer hesitated. "Not recently." The judge nodded slowly, almost with disappointment. "Then this young lady has done more thorough review in the last few weeks than the adults responsible for representing this case?" The room went silent again. A quiet shock settled over everyone. The teen felt her face warm, and she lowered her head, not wanting to be looked at like someone special. She wasn't trying to be extraordinary. She just wanted things to be fair. The judge rested his hands on the papers. "We will need to pause the proceedings for a short recess," he said. "I want to verify the details brought to my attention." As he said that, he glanced toward the teen and gave a small, thoughtful nod, not a gesture of authority, but one of respect. The teen watched him leave the courtroom with the documents in hand, knowing that something she said, something she almost kept to herself, was now shaping the entire direction of the case, and she didn't know it yet. But this wasn't the end of her involvement. It was only the beginning. What she had shared was not a small correction. It was the turning point that would soon change everything. The recess felt longer than it actually was. The courtroom emptied slowly as people stretched their legs or stepped outside to talk quietly in the hallway. The teen stayed in her seat, holding her folder close, not wanting to go anywhere. She didn't feel like walking around or hearing people whisper about her. She just wanted the hearing to finish so life could go back to normal. Her guardian placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. Her heart was still beating faster than usual, and her nerves felt like they were tangled together. "I just hope I didn't mess anything up," she whispered. "You didn't," he replied softly. "You gave them information they needed. That's all." She wanted to believe that. But part of her still worried, what if she misunderstood something small? What if the judge checked everything and it turned out she had been wrong? The thought made her stomach twist. She never wanted to stand out. She never wanted attention. She definitely didn't want anyone thinking she was trying to be smarter than them. She had only wanted clarity. People began drifting back into the courtroom. Some smiled at her kindly as they passed. Others nodded as if acknowledging her courage. A few whispered something to their companions, but their tones didn't seem harsh. They seemed surprised, impressed, and maybe even grateful, but she still sat quietly, hands tucked under her folder, eyes lowered. She never asked for attention. She never wanted it. When the door behind the judge's bench opened and the judge returned to the room, conversations instantly faded. Everyone stood as he took his seat again. His expression didn't reveal much. He looked thoughtful, calm, and maybe a little more focused than before. "You may be seated," he said. The teen watched him cautiously. His hands rested on the files in front of him. She noticed the sticky note she had placed earlier still attached to one of the pages he was reviewing. It made her breath catch. Seeing her handwriting on the judge's desk felt unreal. The judge took a moment before speaking. When he finally did, his voice carried more weight than before. During the recess, I carefully reviewed the documents and the points raised. The room fell into a deeper silence. The judge continued, and I have to say, the concerns brought forward were not only valid but essential. A small ripple moved across the courtroom, soft reactions, nods, surprised expressions. The teen held her breath. The rule referenced was indeed overlooked, the judge said firmly. And the timeline discrepancy affects the foundation of the earlier conclusion. Her guardian exhaled quietly, shoulders relaxing just a little. The judge shifted his gaze to the lawyers. I understand that errors happen, he said calmly, but in this situation the oversight was significant. Had this young lady not spoken up, the case would have proceeded on an incomplete and inaccurate understanding. One lawyer lowered his head slightly. Another seemed embarrassed. A third appeared thoughtful, perhaps realizing how much work needed to be redone. The judge looked toward the teen. Would you please stand? Her breath hitched. She slowly rose, hands clasped in front of her, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. You have shown remarkable clarity, the judge said. His tone was not dramatic or overly emotional. It was measured, respectful, and sincere. Most people your age do not take the time to study legal documents, and certainly not with the level of focus you demonstrated. She didn't know what to say. Her cheeks warmed and she lowered her eyes slightly. What you did today, he continued, was not only brave but extremely helpful. You paid attention. You cared. You spoke with honesty and respect. And because of that, the truth is clearer. She swallowed hard. Hearing those words felt strange, comforting, yet overwhelming. The judge took a deeper breath. Your observations require us to correct the earlier conclusion. The case must move in a different direction now. The courtroom reacted with quiet but noticeable surprise. The teen blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. She had understood that her words were important, but she didn't know they would change the entire course of the case. The judge then said something she would remember for a long time. It is rare, he said gently, for someone so young to have this level of insight and steadiness. You should be proud of yourself. Her eyes stung slightly. She wasn't crying, but the emotion hit unexpectedly. She nodded faintly. You may sit down now, he said kindly. She returned to her seat, still dazed. Her guardian gave her a tiny smile, proud but trying not to overwhelm her. The judge then addressed the courtroom again. We will proceed, but with corrected information and a new direction. This will ensure fairness for all parties involved. He spent several minutes explaining how the case would continue and which decisions needed to be reconsidered. Each time he referenced the timeline or the rule. He acknowledged that the teen had pointed out details that affected those steps. The lawyers cooperated respectfully, no longer brushing aside the details she had mentioned. They asked more careful questions. They cross-checked information more thoroughly. And for the first time in months, the case felt grounded in clarity rather than confusion. Throughout all of this, the teen stayed quiet. She didn't want to speak again unless absolutely necessary. She felt relieved that the judge was taking everything seriously. She felt grateful that the adults now understood the mistakes. But she still didn't want attention. Several times, she caught people smiling softly at her, not pitying smiles, but warm ones. Even the court clerk, who rarely looked at anyone directly, gave her a small nod. As the hearing moved toward its end, the atmosphere felt lighter, almost peaceful. The confusion she had sensed for so long was finally fading. When the judge prepared to close the session, he looked at her one more time. Young lady, he said gently, you've done something today that many adults struggle to do. You brought clarity, courage, and respect into this room. That is something admirable. She nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. Thank you, Your Honor, she whispered. After the judge left and the courtroom started emptying, people began approaching her guardian. Some thanked him quietly. Others asked if the teen had always been so observant. Her guardian simply smiled and said, She just pays attention. That's all. A woman who had been sitting in the back approached the teen gently. You were very brave, she said warmly. Not many people would have spoken up like that. The teen felt shy and only managed a small smile. I just didn't want anything unfair to happen, she replied. Another person said, "You did something good today." Someone else added, "You have a gift? Don't stop using it." She didn't know how to accept compliments well, so she simply nodded politely. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to be special. She had just tried to help. When she and her guardian finally walked out of the courthouse, the evening sun hit the building softly, casting long shadows on the ground. She breathed in the fresh air, feeling like her lungs finally had space again after hours of tension. Her guardian walked beside her quietly for a moment before saying, "You know, the judge was right." "About what?" she asked softly. "You do have something special. Not everyone pays attention. Not everyone cares enough to read every page. And not everyone has the courage to speak." She looked down at the folder in her hands, the edges slightly bent from how tightly she had held it. "I was really scared," she admitted. "I thought maybe I'd get in trouble for talking." "You didn't," he said with a gentle smile. "You helped. And that's what matters." They walked a few more steps before she whispered, "Do you think everything will be okay now?" "Yes," he replied with quiet certainty. Because today, the truth was heard. The teen let out a long, shaky breath. The worry she had been carrying for weeks finally began to loosen. She didn't know what the future looked like. She didn't know what decisions would come next. But she knew something important. She had done her part. She had spoken when it mattered. And she had changed the direction of something far bigger than herself. As they walked toward the parking lot, someone from behind called out, "Excuse me." She turned slightly. One of the lawyers hurried toward her, carrying papers under his arm. He wasn't stern or frustrated. He looked thoughtful. "I just wanted to tell you," he said with a small smile, "you have a real talent for understanding details. If you ever think about studying law someday, I think you'd do very well." The teen blinked, surprised. She had never imagined anything like that. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I was just trying to understand what was happening." He nodded. "And that's exactly how it starts." When she got into the car with her guardian, she sat quietly for a moment, thinking, not about attention or compliments or being noticed, but about this strange feeling inside her, a sense of calm that came from doing what was right. She didn't try to be remarkable that day. She didn't try to be brave. She simply spoke up when the truth mattered. And without realizing it, she had changed everything.